think of our information diet like our food diet. There's a lot of junk food out there, and a lot of it is really tasty. And often it's more accessible. There's more of it than the healthy stuff. And we know how many calories and how much fat is in it, but we consume it anyway because it's so good. They're like potato chips. They're addictive. And we have to be responsible. Like, okay, I've got this. Thanks to my algorithm, can I trust this information? How do I know this person is for real? And so where that used to be the editor or the producer asking those questions before it went to the news consumer, now it's going directly to the news or information consumer. More information, more sources, and now more people, but less gatekeeping. You are your own gatekeeper. Every one of us. We have to decide, what are we going to consume?
Hi, I'm Ryder Hask, and this is the People's TV Podcast. In this episode, I talk with Frank Sesno, an Emmy Award-winning journalist who spent over 20 years at CNN as a White House correspondent, anchor, and Washington bureau chief. He's interviewed 5 U.S. presidents, authored Ask More, a book about the power of asking great questions, and now he leads the George Washington University's Alliance for a Sustainable Future. In this conversation, we talk about the media landscape, his advice for identifying good journalism, and much more. Frank was my professor in college, so catching up with him has been a real treat. Thanks so much for tuning in. And Frank, I'm so excited to talk to you. I'm so grateful that you're here. Thank you so much for being here. And I've been wanting to ask you this question for a long time, which I'm surprised I never knew. But tell me about where you grew up and what your childhood was like.
So I was born in New York City, and my parents fled when I was about 4, and they moved out to the burbs in Connecticut, first in Fairfield, and a little town called Wilton in sort of southwestern Connecticut, Fairfield County. But my childhood was probably defined, and I see it more clearly now than when you're closer to it, by a very interesting family dynamic. I had a sister who had Down syndrome. She passed away just about a year ago now. Made it to 67, which was pretty amazing. High-functioning, very independent woman, but as a child, she really defined the family dynamic. So there was strife within the family because my mother wanted to be the crusader and push the envelope, because when my sister was a little girl, there was very little public education or support for kids with disabilities. And my dad was not so much into that. He wanted to come home and have the steak and potatoes on the table, like, you know, the 1950s and 60s dads that were too common then. But it was a really enriching experience in so many ways. To grow up around my sister and people with disabilities gave me a real sense of the human range and capacity and the beauty of life in all of its different colors and stripes. And also the need to give voice to people who didn't otherwise have a seat at the table. And I think ultimately that really colored my interest in journalism and the work that I did there in telling people's stories, and even in teaching and working at the university.
And so that era, I'm trying to think back to what your big influences would have been. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about, as a teenager, as you're sort of coming of age, what were you reading, watching, listening to that was like shaping your worldview?
Too much. I came of age at a really tumultuous time. It's interesting, too, because as we see where we are right now and what's going on in our society now, it was the Vietnam War. It was the civil rights movement. It was the women's rights movement. It was an environmental movement. It was Woodstock. The world was exploding in many ways. It was exploding with strife and with division, but also with movements and breakthroughs. It was the space program. It was, incredible times. My earliest memories, very much as a kid listening to the news, which I always did, was about the Vietnam War. And I would have, I remember hearing about the war in Vietnam and guerrilla forces. I was so young, I thought they were gorillas. I remember one night having a nightmare, but that there were gorillas at the front door and out of our house, and I went running into my parents' bedroom to say, there are gorillas out there. But that's what was churning out there. What was churning out there was, Richard Nixon as president and Watergate. And, that I was in high school when that happened. And it was this formative thing that, the president of the United States had tried to break into the Democratic campaign headquarters, and people were covering up and lying. And, so it was a really dramatic time. The only time I remember my mother crying. My mother was a very strong, sometimes too strong woman. But my mother was a very strong woman. The only time I remember her crying was 1968, and Bobby Kennedy had been shot. And we had been through, Martin Luther King being shot, and cities were burning, and there were, National Guard in the streets, and then that happened. And I remember her sitting on the steps in the living room crying and saying, she used the wrong term, but she said, we're having a revolution. I think she meant, I don't know what she meant, civil war, whatever. But she meant the country was coming apart at the seams, and it was. It was an incredible moment, and that really were some of the big moments that shaped me.
And were there figures in the news like there are today that were influencing your opinion? Were there professors or teachers that you had in high school? Were there books that you're reading or other things that kind of helped crystallize how you saw yourself or America and our position in the world that helped you understand who you are and all of this madness?
A lot. I mean, it's an interesting thing to sort of deconstruct. It was everything from, John F. Kennedy. I was in second grade when he was shot. That left, I remember to this day being lined up in the cafeteria, being told what had happened, and being sent home. And I don't think I can describe clearly enough how traumatic that was for the country. It was a time when there were 3 networks, when there were 5 channels in the New York area, metropolitan area, and in other places even fewer. So everybody consumed the same source of information. People went to the same place, and the nation gathered and mourned. I was in second grade, and I remember that. I remember when Bobby Kennedy was shot. This was years later, obviously, as I mentioned, 68. And one of the channels, one of the local channels in New York went dark, and they just put up a slate or whatever that said shame or something like that. And that's what was up there while the national channels were going. But it was a time of incredible upheaval. And yet, I also remember, because this also shaped my childhood, Neil Armstrong stepping on the moon. I was at summer camp. We were listening on transistor radios, clustered around a bunch of, 16, 17-year-old, kids at the time, and listening to this riveting moment where humanity was exploring the heavens. And again, it brought the world together. And I think that one of the really formative experiences that I had growing up, and it makes it such a contrast to today, was this idea of people coming together to get information, to learn what was going on, whether it was what was happening in Vietnam, the tragedy that was happening in the street, or the triumph that was taking place on the moon. And then there were the 1969 Miracle Mets. And so that was something else that we gathered around. So, but there were a lot of very interesting forces. So who were mentors? Who were heroes? It was everything from, John F. Kennedy. The torch is passed to a new generation. Taking it up from Dwight Eisenhower, who was a hero from the war, to the Neil Armstrongs and the explorers. It was a very dynamic time here and abroad.
Tragedy and triumph. Yeah.
Tragedy, triumph, violence, and discovery. It was a time that I think people felt a sense of possibility, but we were also losing our innocence. And so there was this very difficult but dynamic time of coming of age, really, and seeing both what was possible and living the impossible.
So that brings us to your college years. Tell me about that transition to university and what you studied. What was the environment like? Maybe you can contrast it a little bit from what you see these days on college campuses.
Well, I was always interested in language and the world And so I wanted to study languages. I had done that in middle school and high school. I wanted to continue and pick up new languages in college. I was a little bit the product of the sort of the anti-establishment movement of the 60s and 70s, and so I expressly did not want to go to one of the big Ivies. I probably could have, but I wanted a smaller, more intimate experience, and so I ended up at Middlebury College in the middle of Vermont, lodged beautifully between the Adirondacks and the Green Mountains. And I ended up there as an American history major. I intensively studied French and picked that up as a minor so that I could speak that language passably, if not fluently. And what I ended up doing as my senior thesis was, and as I think of it, a prelude to being a journalist, which was to diving deep and doing the research and writing what became a story about the policies of the federal government toward Native American education and children, boarding schools, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, assimilation, and some of the things that were done to stamp out indigenous cultures through these boarding schools, which have come to light even more and very dramatically and in some cases tragically since. But it was a great experience, learning experience for me. I buried myself in the congressional record, and I found remarkable things. The only good Indian is a dead Indian is a comment that was made on the floor of the United States Congress. How shameful is that? I communicated with tribes, and they talked to me about how they were trying to manage the sort of trajectory of federal policy. And the federal policy literally went from extermination to self-determination through assimilation and all the shuns, right, that then played themselves out in these schools. So my college experience was one of kind of learning things like that. Probably my most influential. There were several. Professor was a guy named John Spencer, who was a history professor. But he had spent a lot of time in Africa and then decided he wanted to teach, and he was a remarkable teacher on top of everything else. But he had done these two very distinct careers, and that's where I got the idea in my head that I wanted to have distinct careers in my life, that I wanted to have not just different jobs but different careers, because it just used different, as he said, muscles in the brain, and I loved that. So my college time was one of great discovery. I was very active at the college radio station. I was in student government. It was a time of change and churn, and that was fun and challenging, and I remained very engaged with my alma mater. My wife went there. I didn't know her there. We met later. 2 of my 3 kids went there, and it's a remarkable place still where people go and discover.
Love that, and I'd love to talk more about your experience with the Native American histories there. We've done a little bit of work recently, but I would really love to hear about the transition from college to your sort of first experience in the workplace, and then how that eventually led you to your first kind of major break career-wise.
So I did not go to college knowing what I wanted to do. You meet people who are 9 years old and they say they want to be brain surgeons, and they go off and they become amazing brain surgeons. Others who are in a process of discovery. I went to school knowing what interested me, the world, languages, events, but not saying I want to be a journalist. It kind of emerged, and now as I look back, I get it. When I was in high school, I did the morning announcements. Oh, it was a microphone. That was fun. And when I was in college, when I was in high school, I did the student newspaper. So I was doing that already. And I discovered the power of words. You'd write an op-ed, and suddenly the Board of Education called me in to speak to the board meeting, and I'm a 16-year-old. That's kind of heady stuff, but you realize the power of words and ideas. When I was in college, I switched over to radio, and I was a DJ, and I was a program director, and I was just having fun. I worked at the radio station in town, where I was also a DJ, but I did the news. And when I was getting ready to graduate, I had gone into college thinking I was going to be pre-law. That didn't last very long, because I discovered that I just didn't want to bury myself in that. I wanted to get myself out and into the world in a different way. So when I was in my senior year, I was kicking around, and somebody set up an interview for me in New York, and I went and I met with this unctuous guy who was in HR, and he said, "What do you want to do when you're 40 years old?" And I said, "I'm 21. I don't know what I want to do when I'm 40 years old." Well, he says, "What do you want for yourself?" And I said, "Well, I want some degree of independence. I want to be creative, and I want to make a contribution." And he basically said, "Well, you don't want to work here then." So I went down to the sidewalk, and I looked around in New York City, and I said, "I do not want to be here. This is a jungle." And I love New York City, but it's not where I wanted to work. So I started applying for radio and newspaper jobs in more rural areas, smaller communities where I felt I could connect with people. I got several job offers, and I started. My first job was at a little radio station in a town of 16,000 across the river from a little city, a little bit bigger, on the Vermont-New Hampshire border, and it was a great job. The place was small enough that I had to do everything, and I had the luxury of making mistakes, and I made a few of them. But what it did is it got me out to school board meetings and town selectmen meetings, and the meeting with the town manager, and talking to small businesses and talking to people. It was a machine tool town. The machine tool industry was there, and Japanese imports were starting to bite, and people were losing their jobs. So there was a lot of concern in the community. What was going to replace this? These are good union, relatively high-paying jobs. There was nothing to replace that. And so you saw that dislocation. And so it was a great opportunity for me to tell stories at a really granular level about what was happening in the neighborhood, in the community, where people knew and cared about one another. I was 22 years old, and I'm interviewing the governor. I'm interviewing Pat Leahy, who had just been elected to the United States Senate the year before. And so it was incredible access, and at a scale that Thomas Jefferson would be proud, because Vermont communities selected their budgets, for example, with town hall meetings, town meetings. People would go, and they'd stand up, and they'd vote, and they'd debate, and they'd yell, and they'd scream. So that's how I got launched in journalism. And while I was in Vermont, I'd heard about something at the Voice of America, which has recently basically been shut down. But it was America's global storytelling platform, right? It was meant, it was started out of the Cold War to send truth, information behind the Iron Curtain. And I applied because I thought, oh, this is fun. News, planet, globe, languages. And I got accepted. And so that's how I moved to Washington and went from there.
So fast forwarding a little bit, you were around for probably the earlier days for CNN. Tell me about your start there. This was sort of the advent of cable and the 24-hour news cycle, and I'm sure it had a big impact on your thinking. So what was the transition like that from small-town journalism to sort of national-level journalism and working at CNN?
I went from small-town journalism. I came here to Washington to the Voice of America, and then from the Voice of America I went to AP and AP Radio, and so I was a radio correspondent with AP, based here in Washington, and then very quickly I ended up in London. So I was our overseas correspondent. At 24, I'm standing around looking in London, and okay, now what do I do? And I ended up with some huge stories while I was there, from the rise of sort of Margaret Thatcher and the conservative political movement in the UK, union busting, all the rest, to the troubles in Northern Ireland, to the shooting of the Pope, to the wedding of Prince Charles and Princess Di. I did all those things. That's when I was there. And that included time spent in Poland when Solidarity, the union that challenged communism right from the beginning in the 80s, was coming and taking shape. And Lech Wałęsa, I traveled the shipyards of Gdansk with Lech Wałęsa to watch that remarkable movement. And people in Poland who said, we'll stand up to the Soviet Union if they invade, and there will be blood in the streets. I mean, it was an incredible thing. So for a kid to be doing that kind of stuff was really remarkable. They brought me back, the AP brought me back to cover the White House, and I started covering the White House when Reagan was president and some other things. And then I joined CNN when CNN was 4 years old.
Wow.
So CNN was still a baby place. Most people didn't know what CNN was. When I started at CNN and I was at the White House, I'd call the press office and they would not know who CNN was. I would say, well, this is Ted Turner's network. One time I called, I remember, and they said, is this the phone company? because one of the phone companies at the time was C&P. And so they thought I was like the phone guy, which was very strange. But CNN was a revolution, because for the first time ever, we were bringing the world to people who had cable 24/7. It didn't have to wait till 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the evening news and Walter Cronkite giving something a 12-second soundbite, or Dan Rather at the time. We would bring a presidential news conference and put it on the air, and people could see the entire news conference, or a presidential speech, or a crisis. Probably the big early one, there was a hijacking, TWA 847, on the tarmac in Beirut. I believe it was 1987 when this took place. And we were carrying it and pictures from it live. And it wasn't just the public that was watching that. It was also at the highest levels of the American government, the CIA, the National Security Council. In fact, I had the White House Chief of Staff semi-jokingly say to me, we don't need the CIA anymore, we now have CNN. We were actually bringing in information and imagery faster than the CIA was, because it was just live and in real time, as opposed to coming in and being digested and turned around or turned into a cable or a memo or whatever else. And we had the capacity to bring pictures and sound. So what we saw was that leaders started communicating differently. The political debate started happening differently. A crisis around the world could be brought into an American living room anywhere, instantly. And certainly that culminated. I was, at the White House for when we had the first Gulf War, and Peter Arnett and Bernie Shaw and John Holloman were in Baghdad, and the missiles started flying, and 1 billion people around the world watched CNN, because we were the only ones who had the 4-wire in there. That's what it was called, that allowed us to get the pictures, the video out in real time, live.
Wow.
And so again and again and again, I remember I did our Sunday talk show, and I remember interviewing the then president of Turkey. Turgut Özal was his name. And we had just been airing live congressional hearings as we were ramping up for deployment for Iraq. And before we went on the air with the president of Turkey, he said, "Oh, Mr. Sesno, I want to thank you on behalf of all of Turkey and CNN for what you have done." And I said, "What have we done?" He said, "You have taught us about democracy." He said this. And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Your live coverage of your congressional hearings taught us about democracy." This was exhilarating stuff, but it was sobering too, because I realized how much impact and influence we could have, or I could have, when I stood in front of a camera and uttered some words, or when we turned our cameras on to something like a congressional hearing and the world watched.
Yeah, I just got goosebumps as you say that, because it's just makes the world such a smaller place and more accessible and more instant.
To include when something bad happened, like that hijacking, that TWA hijacking. I will never forget the picture of the hostage takers holding a gun to the pilot's head.
Wow.
And we were told at the time, it was very interesting, because I was told afterward by people at the White House, senior officials, that they had actually asked some of the national security officials who had to make really hard decisions to turn CNN off. They were concerned that people would be so drawn into the moment or make an emotional attachment because of what they were seeing, that they might not be able to make the hard decision to storm the plane when they knew people would probably die. So it became something that was so different that they were concerned that it would alter decision making. It did actually when the early on. These are all early days. You have to remember, this is before smartphones. This is before social media. This is before digital anything. But what we were doing is we were bringing into a decision-making process the first real-time imagery. And it was changing the way people factored in what they were seeing and experiencing and how they made decisions. So when there was a coup attempt in the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, and to oust Gorbachev, one of the early indicators that the coup wouldn't work, and it drove American decision making. There was a news conference. I think there were 5 generals who were trying, who were in the military, among the military coup plotters, and they just clearly seemed incompetent, uncoordinated, and hesitant. And seeing that news conference on CNN prompted the administration, then it was the Bush administration, to side very vocally with Gorbachev, and who was the president they were trying to oust, and distance themselves. And some of that, American policy articulated in that way helped to drive events.
It all sounds really exciting, and I'm just so curious what the kind of company culture was like. What was the sights and sounds and smells of the newsroom? What was the energy like among you and your colleagues and Ted Turner and everyone involved in this new technology, and you're having such an impact? What was it? What was the vibe?
Well, one of the sights, you say, what are the sights and sounds and smells? Cigarettes. People still smoked cigarettes. Bernie Shaw used to smoke on set. If you ever see the old photos of Edward R. Murrow, smoking on set. So anyway, seriously, it was crazy. It was all new. We were inventing stuff. We had no idea what we were doing half the time. I remember doing an interview, I think it was with Pat Leahy, out on the White House lawn, and the wind blew a light over it, almost knocked his block off. I remember doing an 8-minute piece about the Aral Sea, which was this shrinking sea. It was an environmental piece I had done. And this was for a G7 summit or something like that. And I'm live, and I toss to this 8-minute piece, and it just goes to black. It doesn't air. It doesn't roll. And the producer, the executive producer in the control room just goes, talk, just fill the air. So we had a lot of technology that was brand new, first-time technology, and a bunch of times it didn't work. And so it made us very inventive, and so that was part of the culture. We knew we were doing something different. It was by the bootstraps. There was no money. There was no money. For the first 5 years, CNN was very, very deep in the red. When I first started at CNN, and I looked very young, and one of my executive producers said, you have what we call a youth problem. Somebody else hired me, and I was on the air. He said, I love your stuff, but you, and he says, have you ever thought of wearing glasses? I said, have I ever thought of wearing glasses? The guy who hired me told me to get rid of the glasses that I had and go buy contacts, which I had to pay for because there was no money at CNN to pay for it. Well, he says, get rid of your contacts, go put your glasses back on. So I put my glasses back on. He calls the next day after I glass. He says, that's good. It adds 5 years to your life, but they're ugly glasses. Go buy new glasses. I said, well, are you going to pay for that? He says, no, we have no money for that. You pay for that. Oh, by the way, I had taken a pay cut from the Associated Press to CNN. So there was no money. Working for Ted was amazing because he said, I don't care about any of this. We're going to do it all. He was one of these completely audacious, unbelievably ambitious, incredibly visionary risk takers. And he believed deeply in what CNN was and could do. And so working for him and through all of this, it was just wild. It was crazy. And here I am, this young looking, not very, I had a great face for radio. But I was having these astonishing experiences.
And just thinking about that time and place and your age and the fact that broadcasting was pretty new, but it sounds like you were getting a lot of positive feedback from unexpected places, like you mentioned, like the country of Turkey. Was there a sense that you were kind of famous or like a celebrity? Like, were people stopping you and being like, oh my God, you're from CNN? Or was like the celebrity culture not really there in terms of CNN broadcasters?
No, it was, but remember in the beginning, when I started this, we were literally wiring up for cable in this country. I remember when I started at CNN, I could not watch CNN where I lived in my home in suburban D.C. But I remember clearly the day, and it was right around the time the Challenger blew up because we had just gotten service in my house. I saw that, and then I went into the White House because it was a huge story. But I remember the truck going up with a gigantic cable spool, burying it in the road, coming to our house. It was a big deal. But over time, yes. I mean, Ted was on the cover of Time magazine. CNN was on the cover of different magazines. It was the talk of the town. I would get stopped a lot on the streets. I remember I was in the Soviet Union one time to cover a summit between, I think it was President Bush and President Gorbachev. So this would have been the early 90s. And at the end of the event, we're getting ready to leave. And I'm at the airport and I'm going through customs. And in the line next to me is Dan Rather. Well, everybody knew Dan Rather, right? Dan Rather was the face of CBS. He'd been around for ages. So he's just one person ahead of me in the line next. And he gets up there and I hear the Russian, customs guy go, and he's looking through the guy's passport. Dan Rather, he says, what are you in Soviet Union for? You are doing what? How long have you been here? I get up there, and the guy opens my passport. He says, Mr. Sesno, why is CNN starting to charge for cable? Because we had been starting to distribute CNN internationally, globally, and people in the Soviet Union, this dude was watching, and he knew who I was. So there was a very interesting and very global sense that came with this, yes.
So now that you've sort of been maybe sort of a journeyman level as a journalist, maybe graduating from that to managing people, to being more editorially involved, I'm wondering if in this period anything stands out as sort of helping to refresh your worldview. Were there changes from when you were growing up? You mentioned notable moments from your childhood. Were there kind of a new sort of adult version of that where you redefined your worldview, or did it stay pretty consistent with what you'd experienced as a kid?
When you say worldview, what are you referring to exactly?
Just how you saw America in its place in the world and the global history as it was unfolding. You'd mentioned Watergate being sort of this sense of cynicism, or the Vietnam War sense of conflict and violence. Were those feelings changing or kind of getting more deepened in some way?
Well, I think I always had an appreciation and interest in our history, and our history goes through periods and chapters and waves. What I was covering, what was sort of the formative years for me, was really shaped by the Reagan Revolution. And that was a sort of conservative revolution that came to Washington. Ultimately, it took a while, but it upended what was decades of Democratic control in the Congress. Not right away when Reagan came in. He was dealing with Democrats, Tip O'Neill and all the rest initially. But ultimately, and the ultimate legacy of the Reagan Revolution really was to upend things. So we started seeing, the emergence of culture wars, even as we were still in superpower rivalries and with major nuclear adversaries. We saw in the midst of all of that, though, that there could be, just enormous change. I mean, probably the biggest single thing that changed my worldview was a changing world, right? When no one thought that the wall would come down. No one ever imagined that the Soviet Union, this massive nuclear empire, would just crumble. And what that meant, and the sort of period of history that took us into, a unipolar world, in some ways an ahistorical world. Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History. Like, what does that mean? And it turned out to be untrue, obviously. But we went through this very turbulent time. I mean, I sometimes think of my experience as sort of Forrest Gump-like, because, I was there when a president said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I was there when the wall came down. I was on the west front of the Capitol when the first black man, became president of the United States. First black president was sworn in. And so to see this sort of sweep of history playing out on a day-by-day basis with deadlines every minute. So, it was pretty intense at times. That, I think, is what has given me my sense of the sweep of history. And we go through eras in this country. And that, I think, is a very powerful sense. And it brings a certain sense of, we don't know where we're going at any given moment. But the forces are many and complicated and unpredictable.
I know you covered 9/11, is that right? Yeah, I think for me, that was very much the JFK moment. I was in 8th grade at the time, and my middle school was just a few blocks from the World Trade Center. And so it wasn't even through a screen for me that I saw that whole disaster play out. I'm curious how that maybe influenced you in journalism, or was this sort of in the broader arc of the story you're just telling about the changing world?
No, I don't think 9/11 was in a broader arc of history. No one anticipated that. No one could have imagined that. That was such a traumatic, tragic moment. It was like the moments that maybe we saw earlier that I was talking about, whether it's a space shot or the assassination of JFK. One of those very few moments in a national experience where everyone is affected, where everyone pays attention, where everyone is sharing this range of emotions. I'll never forget that day. I was at the doctor with my son and my wife. He was going to have tubes in his ears, a procedure. The television was on in the waiting room. I looked up, and one of the World Trade Towers was smoking. There was smoke coming out of it, billowing smoke. And as I watched, I saw the plane fly into the second tower. And I just instantly knew. I was the bureau chief here in Washington, so I was responsible for the bureau and for our coverage and for our staff. And I said, I need to get in now. So I left. As I was driving in and coming up onto the 14th Street Bridge, I'd heard nothing about this. I saw a huge plume of black smoke billowing from the Pentagon. And I nearly stopped on the bridge to just kind of call into CNN and maybe go on the air or whatever. But we didn't know what it was. We could just say, there's smoke coming out of the Pentagon. My hand was shaking so much I could barely call in, but I did. And I got there, and the first thing we did was to put cameras on the roof of the CNN bureau aimed at the Capitol, because we knew there were 7 planes still left in the air. They grounded all the planes, but there were 7 planes left, and one of them was headed to Washington. And so there was concern, where was that plane being? And that's the one that went down in Pennsylvania. But this was a very traumatic thing. I mean, everybody was shocked and in tears and all the rest, but we knew we had a big job to do, and we knew we both were at war, and the entire sort of geopolitical chessboard had been reset. This was not, bringing that level of violence to American shores. That hadn't happened during World War II. Who were these people? Who were they fighting for? What did they stand for? Who else was out there? We didn't know any of that. So, that was a really redefining experience, and we're still feeling it today.
Yeah. I mean, I think about it as sort of a peak of patriotism and perhaps maybe the peak of trust in media at the same time.
And trust in government.
Yeah.
And trust in government. I mean, Ryder, this is one of the most interesting things, and it's something that I think about a lot. After 9/11, the president's approval rating went up into the 90s, President George W. Bush. And trust in government went way up. Why? We had been attacked. There was something that focused everybody's attention, and government had a job to do, which was to protect us. And people agreed on that. And it was a remarkable and very sobering moment in American history.
So I know it's a big jump, but fast forwarding, say 20 years, what changed in CNN, in the news media? Because I think clearly there was an erosion of trust that happened at some point, polarization exacerbated by foreign conflicts and other things at home. Do you see that as like the turning point for how things have since unfolded, or what other factors influenced our current media landscape?
Yeah, it's a really good question. A lot of things changed. First of all, in 1996, the cable dial was exploding, and MSNBC and Fox came on the air. So CNN was not the only place. So the sources of information started to diversify, and Fox came on the air with the sense that conservatives had been poorly served. We report, you decide. That's what they said in the out. Fair and balanced, that was their thing. And that was one thing that was happening. Secondly, we had the growth of digital media. that was also emerging in the mid to late 90s. And people were starting to be able to go to other places. So I remember very clearly newspapers started saying, oh gosh, by the time we hit people's doorsteps, they were still hitting people's doorsteps, people have already learned what has happened on their digital platform, whatever that is. So we need to be more interpretive in the news that we're providing. So the technology drove changes in the audience, drove changes in the journalism, drove more of a push to start to get ratings, circulation, whatever, as the competition intensified. You know, fast forward another 10 years and social media starts to emerge, and now people are sounding off, and we end up in a place where we are today. You know, the ultimate of this media revolution that in some ways CNN started has been more information, more sources, and now more people, but less gatekeeping. You know, when I was a bureau chief, I remember on more than one occasion stopping a reporter from putting his or her story on the air because how many sources have you got? Go back and get another source. We need a better quote, whatever it is. That's what we did in newsrooms. That gatekeeping function doesn't happen in social media. So the change that we saw was very dramatic. More sources, more people, more voices, more noise, more distraction, and more competition. And that's led to this, you know, wild and woolly world we're in now.
Mm. And what's your current assessment of the journalism and media landscape?
There's great journalism taking place, but I make a very strong distinction, and I think this is really important, a distinction between media companies and journalism. Or it's not even a media company, just media. Anybody with a camera, a microphone, a smartphone, whatever, can do media. You can hold up your camera and shoot video of a festival or a police shooting and then put that out there. And you're doing citizen reporting. That's different than citizen journalism. Journalism is about tracking down sources, doing investigations, making sure that you've got multiple sources, making sure that you're thinking about a story ideally from all angles and really presenting something in a clear and coherent way. Capturing a moment, which is a wonderful thing and very important, and anybody can do it who's got as I say, a smartphone, is something altogether different. The opinions that we have now, and this isn't completely new, you know, Father Coughlin did it in World War II, and Rush Limbaugh invented it, you know, in more modern times. But now it's kind of run amok with all kinds of cable channels, online media, digital media, YouTube videos that are out there, and it's a wild competition for people's attention and reality. I think the way I think of it is that the fundamental responsibility and burden has shifted. Remember I talked earlier about gatekeepers, the role we had as gatekeepers, making sure something was good, accurate, well done before it goes on the air or wherever. The gatekeeper is no longer the news producer, it's now the news consumer. You are your own gatekeeper, every one of us. And we have to be responsible. Like, okay, I've got this on my algorithm, thanks to my algorithm showing up on my homepage or wherever. Can I trust this information? How do I know this person is for real? And so where that used to be the editor or the producer asking those questions before it went to the news consumer, now it's going directly to the news or information consumer. I think of our information diet like our food diet. There's a lot of junk food out there. A lot of it is really tasty. And often it's more accessible. There's more of it than the healthy stuff, right? Most of it is actually labeled. And we know how many calories and how much fat is in it. But we consume it anyway because it's so good. It tastes so good with a beer or a Coke or whatever it's going to be. And same thing, you know, all the conspiracy stories, all the whatever, they're like potato chips. They're addictive. And they're everywhere. And so we have to decide, what are we going to consume?
And I'm thinking about, you know, the sort of traditional way of growing a media culture in a country, and we've got professional journalists, and we've got undergrad and graduate level journalism. This is a very serious career. that people have a long history of and they take it very seriously. I get the sense now that those institutions, like you said, are so fractured and so independent, and so many of them, their top priority really is not telling the truth. You know, like you said, it's entertainment packaged as news. What's a way for people who really, because of the industry, can't necessarily get that internship at CNN and end up at a podcast, or they end up somewhere independent? How can they keep their integrity as journalists and bring that level of ethics and, I guess you use the word gatekeeping, but truth-telling to the jobs that they end up at, when those jobs probably have a slightly different North Star than absolutely telling the truth?
Look, I think there's a lot of really great journalism out there still, even with all the noise. Whether it's the Wall Street Journal or the Guardian or, NPR. Some people say, well, they lean right, they lean left. If you look at the journalism that these news organizations do, there's a lot of great journalism, and people will decide whether they agree or disagree on the framing of the story or how it comes out. Then there are news organizations, there are media companies that don't really try to do that kind of fact-based reporting. They are mostly about opinion and trying to get eyeballs and eardrums and all the rest. I like to call myself sometimes a glass half empty optimist. It's very easy to see the glass half empty, sometimes emptier than that, but I remain optimistic. I think people are still fundamentally hunters and gatherers, and some of the things we hunt and gather is information. What's the weather today? How's our team doing? Is there traffic? Is it safe to walk down the street? And so how are my kids' schools? Is my money being spent wisely when I pay my taxes? These are all seriously good questions that get tangled up in a lot of things. But there is solid information out there, and people want to both consume it and they want to produce it. So to your question about young people, look, people aren't going to have the experience I had. They're not going to start at a little local radio station in a town of 16,000 that had 2 full-time news people and 4 stringers and a little network of stations up and down the Connecticut River Valley in New England. But they may start at a hyper-local online news organization. They may start working for you at People's TV and creating films. They may start being the digital media person at some other organization. There's a lot of storytelling to be done, and there's a lot of fact-based storytelling to be done. Some of it will be done in traditional journalistic ways, as it's always been done. Some of it is going to be done in altogether new ways that are being invented as we speak. There's a lot of effort to support philanthropically local information/news so that people can be informed about their communities. That's where the hit has been the worst over the years. And there's a lot of what I call private journalism. So we see people going to work for causes or for healthcare, for example. And what do? They're making videos to explain how people can live healthier lives, or they're doing podcasts to engage a community leader to explain what they're doing in the community. So this is a time of immense change, and I think challenge, because people have such low regard, such little trust in what has been traditional media and journalism. So part of the job, too, is to go out there and explain to people how this job gets done, how we're neighbors in some cases, and find ways to communicate these things credibly and clearly, and in a way that we can gather again, not the way we did. We'll never do that again, but gather around information that people can believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think basically, just was thinking while you're saying that, it doesn't take the burden off the consumer to have that radar for what is and isn't factual in terms of what they're consuming. Because to your point, a healthcare nonprofit, they're going to have a clear point of view versus a different organization. And even if you feel like they're saying important things or they're telling important stories, it's still on the viewer or the listener to look deeper rather than take any source at face value. Would you say that's basically the equation?
100%. I mean, I wrote a book about questions, book's called Ask More. And I think what news consumers need to do is come to a lot of the information they're consuming with a series of questions. Where is this coming from? Who is the source? Is it clear? Is there an agenda? Are they asking tough questions of lots of people here? If there's a byline or a reporter or somebody, who is this person? And for people to understand what journalism, what I call good information actually tries to do, which is to seek the truth, not to make an argument. And in seeking the truth, you ask tough questions of everybody, right? How are you going to pay for this? What have other people said about it? So news consumers have more work to do now. It's also an opportunity, though, for traditional news organizations. Like, prove yourself. Explain to your audience how you go about your job, why you're credible, why you're believable, why you're the better brand.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of people entering their careers in storytelling or in media these days, they may end up at one of these independent channels, or they may end up at a brand themselves.
I think, yeah, and I think that's an important point. As I say, there's a lot of good journalism, very good journalism being done. But I think the trajectory for a young person who wants to be a journalist is much more, what would I call it, a zigzag, not a straight line now. 30 years ago, I don't know, maybe more, maybe less, you could come out of a journalism school and say, well, I'm going to work at a local news organization, then I'm going to move up to a regional, and then I'm going to be statewide, and then maybe someday I can be at the New York Times. That was, or CBS, depending on what part of journalism you want to do. That trajectory doesn't exist like that anymore. It's going to be a much more opportunistic, unpredictable, entrepreneurial journey, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to your point about private media, is sort of what I'm seeing. For instance, and I think it does apply to broader media networks as well, who are often criticized for being beholden to their advertisers. And so people often will bring that skepticism to whatever coverage is, particularly if it's about the industry that is on the commercials in between the segments, which I feel like is a reasonable criticism. But how would you say that whether you're making independent films or independent media or just broadcasting, journalists can push back against that notion of being sort of bought and paid for by the sponsors, by the private influences on their companies?
Transparency. That's how you do it. You have to be really, really clear with your sponsors going into these things as you make the film or as you enter the enterprise. There's a firewall, if there's a firewall, between the sponsorship or the funding that you provide and the editorial output that I'm doing. Otherwise, it's a promotional film or it's a commercial or whatever, and that's fine too. That's fine. People can promote their wares, but the world needs to know that. Transparency in the actual reporting of the story, whether it's a film or anything else, where the money comes from, whether it's a crawl at the end, or it's copy that's actually written in. The projects that I do where we get money, I'm very straightforward with the funders before we sign anything. This is going to be great, but you understand, we'll come back to you for fact checking. The facts are right, but you don't get to see the copy. You don't get to frame the story. We're going to do that ourselves, whatever the project is that I'm working on. I think the model for this has been, and it gives me an opportunity to actually shout them out for an important reason. Public broadcasting, public television has the Red Book, and there are all sorts of guidelines in there about what and how money gets used. Can somebody who's funding a film be in the film? The answer is no. There are you can't tell people, you can't have promotional language. To some, this may be distinction without a difference, but I think it's very important. And I do want to shout out, I think having this conversation as we are, Ryder, about where the media have gone and are going and what's going on, it is going to be a big loss to not have public funding for public media. And people can make a very good argument. It's a legitimate argument that, oh, look at the dial, look at cable, look at digital. We don't need this. The need for this doesn't exist as it did when public broadcasting was first formulated. I'd argue actually the opposite, that we need it even more now because the commercial pressures are so intense on the streamers, the Netflixes or the Amazons of the world, to the networks which are clawing to stay relevant and competitive, to the cable channels which are losing audience, and they're all trying harder and harder to grab that eyeball. And in grabbing the eyeball, sometimes the depth and the complexity is lost because you got to get right to that best picture, that catchiest line. TLC was the learning channel. The History Channel did history. Those things are much harder now to see. Public media has filled a role. And so I think it's worth noting that and hoping that public media can find new forms of funding to keep that mission alive, because it's incredibly important. I've done stuff both with NPR and public broadcasting as well as cable and private channels, and it's a significant difference in the approach to programming, information, and journalism.
Yeah. You said it was called the Red Book?
Yeah. So it's a guide. It's a very complex guide that those who are producing, I believe that's what it's called, who are producing media for public media, who work in public media, consult for rules about funding and funders and what can be said and where it can go and how long it can run. So it's a valuable resource, not just for people who are making the media, but actually for the public to realize, you know what, this is just not a random thing. There's a lot of thought that's been put into this.
I wonder if there's some way, so I have like Energy Star stickers on appliances that meet a standard. I wonder if there's like a branding thing that could happen with that Red Book, like Red Book approved or something. Because, I think the reason I bring it up is because I can say, oh, my film was independent all day. It had corporate sponsors, but it was independent. Like this one I was telling you about in the hallway when we were looking at the posters of The Price of Milk.
Yeah.
It was fully independent, but the money came from Oatly. And every time I have a conversation with somebody, I can see their face change as soon as I mention the sponsor. And it's disclosed in the film. But as soon as you say it, as soon as it's out there, people immediately...
So how do you counter that and to say that this did or didn't affect the editorial content of the film?
I mean, and right now the answer is you're going to have to take my word for it. You can look at our notes. You're not going to. You could look at our process. You're not going to. But you'll immediately make that assumption. And I think it's the same tragedy, that CNN and other broadcasters suffered from when every commercial break is a pharmaceutical brand, and they make that connection of like, oh, well, obviously you're never going to say something negative about this sponsor who's paying for all your programming. But like, to your point about those standards of whether it's called the Little Red Book or whatever, it's just what can the consumer trust in as a baseline, rather than just having to take the network or the producer's word for it?
Well, that, their own experience. You get to know a brand, right? People who've bought Fords all their life or Toyotas, and their experience with the brand is fill in the blank.
Right.
You go to a certain doctor over time because you trust that doctor. You like that doctor. So how do you trust a source? Yeah. People watch Ken Burns. Ken Burns has a name. He has a reputation because of a lifetime of work that he has done. Just as the problem is that we live now in such a combative, polarized place that it is really, really easy to trash someone's reputation or to hurl these accusations that you're in somebody's pocket or you're doing propaganda or you're left or right or whatever, and very difficult to dig your way out of that without sounding like you're just whatever. So I wouldn't minimize the challenge, but I think, for example, the Post, the Washington Post, and I'm not going to defend the Post, I'm just going to cite a couple practices they do. as an example, the Post and other news organizations are doing this. If they have to talk to sources on background now without using names, they will often say within the article, we spoke to 12 sources, 3 of whom were aligned with so-and-so and whatever. And so can you be more transparent in how you're reporting your story? If you're reading online and you're reading the op-ed section of the Post and you hover over the word perspective, there's a drop-down that explains what that perspective is, that this is an opinion piece, that they come from different points of view. So this explanation, I've long advocated and lost when I was at CNN, for CNN to have a sort of a public editor or somebody to literally explain, how did we go about the story? Why did we use that picture? Why is that person in the story? And I think that to the extent that news organizations, filmmakers, it's sort of like the director's cut, can explain, take people into the process, trust your audience and speak to them like a grown-up, and be as transparent in how you've done your job as your film is demanding, or your journalism is demanding the airline be, or whoever it is you're talking about, with the transparency with what they're doing, right? We hold everybody else to account, but we're not so good at holding ourselves to account in the same way. And it's time to do it.
Yeah, to make things even more complex here, I just wanted to raise this concept with you that we use in documentary filmmaking, which is there's the factual truth, the journalistic truth, and then there's the greater truth. And I'll say from personal experience, we make great use of the greater truth, because there are many instances when you're particularly editing a film where you do need to Frankenbite a soundbite, taking one piece of a sentence and putting it with another, or the timeline needs to be adjusted because you needed to pick up a shot that happened 3 months ago or is happening in the future and put it into the same sequence to make the story work in how people would understand it best. There's obviously limits there. There's been some notable kind of assaults on that, liberal use of changing how something was phrased or put together. How would you help people understand that difference, how to know the difference, how to either let the viewer trust the filmmaker in this, or to be guarded about what they see and what they feel about how they interpret how an interview was edited or how a film unfolds? Do you find that there should be some best practices here, or how should people look at the difference between journalism and filmmaking, documentaries and journalism, through this lens of like greater truth versus journalistic truth?
That's a really complicated question, and it really depends. If you're talking about journalism, straight journalism, you need to be correct. You're accountable for being correct. You're out to pursue the truth and represent the truth. So, for example, I think that if you're doing a journalistic project or film and something is very delicate or complicated, put the entire transcript of every interview up online, right? And this has been a dispute around 60 Minutes and some other things. How are things edited? How are things cut? When I was at CNN, we had a huge scandal because of selective editing and editors who fell in love with their story, and it was a big mistake. And from that came the Standards and Practices Unit at CNN, where somebody independent would review the entire transcript of an interview to be sure that it was not being taken out of context. And then it became, wherever possible, and I think it should be even more, publishing the entire transcript, or the guts of the entire transcript, where people are talking about the weather. You don't necessarily need that, but give the audience more depth, or what we might call depth or detail on demand. If they want to go see it, go see it. Documentary film is a different thing because, as you say, there can be the truth and there can be a larger truth. And there are times when filmmakers have a point of view that they want to communicate through their filmmaking. They believe that poverty is bad, and they're going to tell a story to show that poverty is bad. And some of that, I don't think that there's ever an excuse for misrepresentation, active misrepresentation. There's no excuse for that. But in taking a different kind of storytelling license, which is what filmmakers will do, because the topic is so huge, or you're covering such a span of time that you can't, in 30 minutes or an hour and a half get everything in. But there can be, cliff notes, or there can be, just as when you go to a play, there's a playbill and there's some explanation, although it's almost always inadequate as to what the play's about. But like I say, director's notes. I like that. What I actually ask myself, I have a very interesting exercise I give my students now. I'll have them do the story, whatever format that's in. It can be print, it can be, video. But then I will have them do a video of themselves speaking about what doing that story meant to them personally, or what they discovered, what was unusual. And it's a very interesting expression, because it invites and actually requires the storyteller to be analytical about the process, and almost by definition a little bit more transparent. But I think that at a time when we have so much distrust of media, there's a new burden on storytellers to understand that and to address that head on. If you were an airline and you were flying planes with as low confidence as we have in the media, you'd be flying empty planes. And you'd launch a massive public information campaign to explain to people what you're doing, why the plane is safe, how it gets taken care of after every flight, so that they would have confidence back in it. I think we should be doing that as storytellers.
I love the idea of the director notes and that being sort of an appendix to a film.
Yeah.
You mentioned your students, and I'd love to talk about your transition from CNN, journalism, to academia, what you've been doing at GW. Obviously, it was a huge influence on me being at the School of Media and Public Affairs just when you were taking over. Tell me about the projects you've been working on after CNN and your work at GW and School of Media and Public Affairs.
Well, the most important projects I've worked on, Ryder, is people like you. And seeing people like you, I remember you were a still photographer, and you had a great eye for that. And I remember when you started dabbling and playing in video, and you had a great eye and ear and mind for that too. And you've done something that you and everybody should be really proud of. And the stories that you have told, and the media that you've done, and the business that you've created, and the other people you're working with. So I left CNN partly because I wanted that second career that I always had in my head, partly because I had done for 17 years this great range of things, and I knew I could continue to do some of them in different ways, but I wanted some new things. So I first went to George Mason University, then I went over to George Washington University, School of Media and Public Affairs, where I was director for 11 years. And the things that I'm proudest of, as I say, are the students that I've taught and interacted with, the program that we put together that I think is really, I hope, really this interesting mix of, yes, storytelling, but also, learning, right, as part of a liberal arts education. I created Planet Forward there now 15, 16 years ago, which was a storytelling platform for students. It's a place where students can tell stories in video, in text, as podcasts, as infographics, in music, whatever they want to do, be storytellers, creative storytellers about this incredible range of things that's happening on our planet: food, water, the built environment, our cities and towns, biodiversity, these incredible critters on land or in the sea, environmental justice, how we behave as a society and where we put our garbage and our toxic waste dumps and the people who are affected by it. And I'm really very gratified to see that as a powerful learning tool and a way for people to take what they've learned and put it out there and share it with other people. If I could do one more cool thing, I'd find sort of this next-gen superstar. I say this in all my classes. Somebody here is going to be a superstar in a variety of different ways. But how do we invent the next iteration, whatever it is, of fact-based media? How do we connect with people in that really competitive space that's out there right now, but still deliver value and still bring the nuance and the complexity? The world is a complicated place. So that's sort of what I'm doing and working on and what motivates me.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about what got you interested in environmental journalism, climate change. Was it a film? Was it just being at CNN? What inspired you to focus on that issue area, and maybe talk about the student projects that you're overseeing?
Well, it probably started when I was a young person, and I went to summer camp out in the Rockies, and I hiked and climbed and rode horses and camped and did all kinds of great things. And I remember so vividly, closing my eyes at night and just listening to the sounds of the creek nearby rushing through, and it was this kind of brilliant, beautiful, spiritual experience of just being out there. And so I think that always stuck with me. CNN, when I had finished 7 years, a little more than 7 years of covering the White House, and I was ready for a change, my pitch to the brass was, and let's create an environmental beat. I want to do that. And I was going to be CNN's first environmental affairs correspondent. We were all signed, sealed, and delivered. And just before we announced it, they asked me to anchor instead, and to anchor shows and do some things. And I really weighed that back and forth and ultimately decided to go with the anchoring because it was just, would be such a prominent role and doing so many different things as it was. But my love and my interest in sort of environmental reporting came because after doing all this reporting all over the place, I felt that this was like the biggest beat out there, because it was about technology, it was about policy, it was about local stuff, your river, global stuff, our air. It was about engineering, and inventing incredible new technologies. It was about people, where they lived. Could we make it better? Because, as I mentioned before, who lives downwind of refineries and toxic waste dumps, and it's mostly lower income communities, people of color. So how do we make everybody's lives better? So I always had a love for that. And when I came to George Washington University, I was thinking, okay, what is the sort of the intersection of learning, teaching, research, and media that we could do that would kind of create this interesting dynamic space? And that's where Planet Forward came from. And as I was kind of unveiling it, or designing it, I guess you'd say, I was talking to a group of brand new students, and I said, we need to name this thing. So let's have a genius brigade. If you want to work with me on this, let's meet whenever at 6 o'clock. I'll bring the pizza. And so we did, and Planet Forward emerged from that. And the idea is, it's about the future. It's about moving something forward. It's about action. It's about what's new and different. Like I like to say, ideas and innovations to move the planet forward. That's fundamentally hopeful, but it's also, by definition, new stuff. It's not, let's have the debate yet again about whether coal is good or bad, or whether nuclear is good or bad, about whether climate change is happening or not. We can have those debates along the way, and we should, because they're part of it. But even more interesting to me is, what are the new technologies that are springing up around us that are by definition new, right? And are they wacky, or are they scalable? And so we've had students do everything, stories from the dance floor at the club that moves when you dance, and in the moving it generates enough power that people can charge their phones from the dance floor. Right? That's not going to change the world, but it's just kind of a cool thing. To the technology of taking carbon out of the atmosphere and mineralizing it and putting it back in the ground. I mean, those are two wildly different stories, but how interesting is that? And we don't have to get into the argument about whether climate change is happening or not. It is. But we can talk about how are we, these incredible creatures called human beings, as smart and creative as we are, dealing with all of this.
And that's incredible. And I was very just blessed to be a part of that first cohort of Planet
Yes,
Forward
you were.
reporters back in the day.
Still have your stories up, I think.
Yeah, I know. It's some of the early stuff that I've made on the internet is that. But just to maybe just challenge this notion of why at all do this sort of thing. I think maybe this is a trend that's passed, but this idea of Gen Z, they call them Zoomers or Doomers, who have a very cynical view of the climate because, as you said, it is warming, and depending on where you're looking, you can certainly get a little upset or perhaps even disenfranchised and negative about where we're headed and what can be done about it. Is there a way to push back against that, or what role does the storytelling play in people's attitude about the future and changing maybe their sense of their role in it?
Huge role. And it's why I do this and why I believe in it so much. I had somebody come visit my class years ago. She worked in the President's Office of Science and Technology Policy. This is during the Obama presidency. And she said to my class, and I swear I did not write this line for her, she said, when it comes to climate change, we don't have a science problem. We have a communication problem. The students, young people today, are very aware and very concerned about climate change. They're some of the more concerning conversations I've ever had. I can't tell you the number of people, I'm sure you've had this conversation yourself with peers and others, who've decided, I'm not going to have kids. I can't bring children into this world. I think we're basically doomed, and I don't want to submit another generation to this. Or they'll say, the most significant thing I can do about my carbon footprint is not have a child, because having children would... This is very sad to me. I have 3 children. I adore them. I believe in life, and I believe in the miracle of love that comes from this that's overpowering. And I actually think we can manage this. What I notice with the storytelling, and I've had the most moving notes I've ever had from students around this kind of thing, who've said, when I started with you and started with this process of learning, I was completely doom and gloom. And we see this in polling, by the way, that this is widespread, but students will express this in first person singular. But then they'll say, as I started to dig into some of these stories, and I started to see what people are doing, and as I told the story myself and I felt I have a voice, I have hope. Doesn't mean they're not concerned, panicked, whatever the word is that you might... Panicked is not the right word, but concerned that they don't feel that there's a crisis, that they aren't outraged and angry that it's been let to go to this point and we're still arguing about whether it's real or not. But in seeing and learning about the incredible people who are spending their brain power and their money and their lives trying to understand this, figure it out, come up with new technologies, have an answer, have a response, mobilize people, change behaviors. There's real hope there, because you actually see that you're not in it all by yourself, that there are really incredible people leaning in. So that, I think, is my response to your question, that these stories really matter, because in finding out the story, you realize, wow, there are really interesting things happening here, and they can scale and make a difference. And secondly, that we're not alone. And sharing these best practices and sharing these things through stories, I think, is dramatic.
Wow, I love having that hopeful message in it. So tell me about what you're working on right now at GW. I know that you've expanded, I guess, your scope of environmental work that you're doing.
So at Planet Forward, we're trying to create, we're standing up something called the Environmental Media Lab right now. This will take students into the wilderness, onto the water, and we're teaching them the photography, videography, the drone technology, the audio capture, to see and to do compelling storytelling from these beautiful, bountiful places, and then post those stories. What I hope to do with the Environmental Media Lab as well is create a little in-house documentary unit so that we can actually be doing some filmmaking too. And filmmaking, if we can do it in the right way, in the most creative way, around some of the research that's being done. How do we bring the research to life? Not as kind of a nerd nut science, numbers crunching kind of thing, but what are the stories that illuminate the research, or that the research is revealing. And I'm very excited about that. I'm also now the executive director of the Alliance for a Sustainable Future at the George Washington University. And this is, we like to call it a dynamic hub that focuses on the cross-disciplinary work of the learning, teaching, of the research, and of sort of the convening to find solutions and have impact. You cannot solve any of these problems if it's, just pick your discipline, a mathematician, a scientist, an engineer in the room. You can solve these complicated problems if you bring a whole bunch of them together, to include people who understand people. How do we connect with communities? How do we speak in a credible voice? How do we build understanding? So solving the problems and then addressing them and having impact is this really interesting cross-disciplinary thing that we're trying to model through the Alliance. Universities have a really good way, like most, of building silos and working. I'm the engineer, I'm the scientist, I'm the mathematician, I'm the sociologist, I'm the musician, whatever it is. But if we can bring everybody together, that's an orchestra. And that's the music we want to make.
Beautiful. I want to hear that music. Where can people find out more about your work?
So they can go to planetforward.org to see the student work, and it's tremendous. We had students this summer who were in the Galapagos. They were out at Ted Turner's Vermejo Reserve, this beautiful space in New Mexico. They were up on the water with Mystic Aquarium doing remarkable research and capturing stories. So some of it's there, planetforward.org. And for the Alliance, they can Google just simply George Washington University Alliance for a Sustainable Future, and they'll see what we're doing there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Frank. This has been awesome.
Thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation. I just want to say, Ryder, and I'm going to ask you a question before we wrap, because it would be unfair not to do that.
Please.
You've done a really wonderful range of work, and I know you've got ambitions to do a lot more. What do you want to do with your voice? What do you want to contribute to public understanding and storytelling?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think film has a big role in shaping public opinion. I think journalism is the sort of daily beat of how we understand our time and place. Film can be more of a cultural moment, and thinking about notable films like An Inconvenient Truth that comes out and really sends ripples through an entire generation. And I think our focus at People's Television and the work that I want to do individually in contributing to that is to make or be a part of those seminal moments in cultural defining filmmaking and documentary, and taking that to its extremes, right? Trying to win an Emmy, trying to win an Oscar, not for the glamour of it, but hopefully because the subject matter in the film is salient enough that it connects with a broader audience and helps move the needle on those issues discussed in the film. Of course, we made Not Going Quietly, which was about healthcare. We made more recently a film about the dairy industry, which is very revealing about what happens behind closed doors in that world. And I hope to make similar films in the future that ask tough questions and examine the truth of the matter at hand, and hopefully communicate that to an audience that would otherwise not be fully exposed to the reporting and the investigative work that was done to tell those stories. So that's certainly our goal, and to do that in different formats. We actually just launched a new podcast show with PBS that is all about science, and so doing that in long format conversations like this between scientists talking about environmental issues or just helping us understand our universe and the world around us better. So making media that is journalistically high quality, not the junk food, but a good salad or high protein, and doing that in a number of ways. So that's our goal for People's Television, to continue to make that sort of premium, high quality content through all the channels that we're able to reach audiences. And then I think, separately is just on the branded side to help our partners tell their own stories. Sometimes they're about legal matters that they need to, focus on from a nonprofit standpoint, or environmental organizations or healthcare advocacy organizations. Not to say that we're a partisan organization, but we certainly have values, and we choose our clients based on our own values. And so when we feel confident about whether it's a foundation or a nonprofit or a brand that shares those values with us, then we're eager to help them tell their story. So it's a long way of saying just continue to do what I've been doing now. And it's been 16 years actually since that, semester at GW where I got involved with Planet Forward, and continuing that mission ever since.
Well, I think you've been successful with these goals, and I think you'll continue to be. And as you know, and it's what you built your career on, stories are incredibly powerful. Most people don't remember a data point or a point in science, but they remember stories. And so by doing that storytelling, I think you're doing what you love, and I know that it's making a difference. So thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
It's been great having this conversation with you.
Yes, likewise.